It was the kind of evening where the air was thick with heat, making every step feel heavier than it should. I had been walking for hours through the dry fields, my shoes kicking up dust as the sun sank lower, painting the sky orange. It was supposed to be a quiet walk, just to clear my head, but something about the isolation was unsettling. The road stretched ahead, twisting through tall grass, and I hadn't seen anyone for miles. I was almost home when I heard the sound, a soft rustling behind me, too rhythmic to be the wind. I spun around quickly, but there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of road. My heart picked up its pace, but I shook my head and kept walking. It was probably an animal, maybe a fox or a rabbit. The rustling continued, but now it was closer. I turned again, slower this time, just enough to catch a glimpse of something darting in the grass. I froze. For a second, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw the shape again, a low, hunched figure. It wasn't a fox, not even close. The way it moved, the way its body shifted, this was something different. A jackal. A wild jackal, alone, pacing along the road behind me. I quickened my pace, my legs feeling heavier now. The jackal stayed a few yards back, never rushing but never falling behind. My breath started coming in short bursts. There were no cars, no houses nearby. The road was as empty as the fields around me. I tried not to look back. I focused on my feet, on the steady beat of my heart, but the sound of the jackal's steps was impossible to ignore. It was getting closer. I glanced behind me again, and I saw its eyes, bright, almost glowing in the dimming light. Its body was low to the ground, muscles rippling as it moved effortlessly through the tall grass. There was no doubt in my mind now. It wasn't following me for curiosity. It wanted something. My hands started shaking, and I picked up my pace even more. Sweat was dripping down my forehead, stinging my eyes. The jackal matched my pace, staying just out of reach. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on me. I couldn't stop now, couldn't let it get any closer. I pushed myself harder, faster, until my legs burned. But the jackal was still there, its eyes never leaving me, and then, suddenly, I heard another noise. A crow. Then another. The sound of birds in the trees up ahead. I hadn't realized it, but I was close to the edge of the forest now. There was a clearing just ahead, and in the distance, I could see the small farmhouse. I wasn't far from safety. The jackal, sensing something, paused. It was a small gap, but it was enough. I didn't stop running, not for a second. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding like it might explode. But when I reached the clearing, I dared a final glance over my shoulder. The jackal was gone. It hadn't chased me into the open space. It had stopped at the edge of the woods, watching, as if it knew the boundary. I didn't stop until I reached the porch of the farmhouse, stumbling up the steps. I glanced back once more, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of the jackal. Just the darkening fields, empty once more. I leaned against the door, still breathing heavily, and finally let the fear wash away. The jackal hadn't followed me all the way to the house. It had stopped when it realized it couldn't go any further. I wasn't sure why, but I knew one thing for sure. If I had stayed on that road just a bit longer, things could have been very different. I locked the door behind me and sat by the window, looking out over the fields. The world felt still now. Safe. And for the first time in hours, I let myself relax. The jackal was gone, and I was home. The jackal and the hen. It was late. The sun had already dipped behind the horizon, and a cold breeze was blowing through the tall grass at the edge of our farm. I had just finished feeding the hens and was heading back to the house, when I heard something unusual, a rustling sound from the nearby brush. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. I paused, heart pounding in my chest. The farm was quiet, too quiet. I glanced around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The chickens had all settled into their coop for the night, and the barn was still. But that sound, it didn't feel right. I grabbed a rake from the shed and walked cautiously toward the noise. The rustling grew louder as I approached the thicket. It sounded like something was moving, something large. My breath came faster, and I tried to keep my steps steady, even though every muscle in my body was telling me to turn and run. Then I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the dark. A jackal. Its fur was thin, matted, and dirty, and its gaze never left me. The thing was too close for comfort, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching, like it was waiting for something. My hand tightened around the rake. I was alone here, no one else was on the farm. If that jackal had been around for a while, it might be desperate enough to attack. I could hear the beating of my heart in my ears as I considered my options. The jackal slowly took a step forward, its muscles tense, its eyes fixed on me. I knew I had to act fast. Slowly, I backed away, my eyes never leaving its stare. But as I moved, I noticed something strange. A hen, one of the ones I'd just fed, was standing outside the coop. How had it gotten out? I glanced at the jackal, realizing that it wasn't alone. Another figure appeared from the shadows, a second jackal. It was circling around the hen, inching closer. My heart skipped a beat. They were here for the chicken. Without thinking, I dropped the rake and sprinted toward the coop. The first jackal lunged at me, but I was faster. I grabbed the hen and threw it back into the pen, slamming the door shut just as the jackals came charging toward me. The second jackal snapped at the air, but I managed to back up into the shed. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do next. I quickly grabbed a pitchfork from the wall and stood near the door, waiting. The jackals circled, growling low, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. It was a standoff. Neither side moved, and for what felt like hours, we just stared at each other, the silence broken only by their growls and the sound of my ragged breathing. I had to hold my ground. If I backed down now, they would get the hen, and possibly me too. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jackals backed off. Slowly, they turned and disappeared into the night. I stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure if they were truly gone. It wasn't until I heard the distant sound of their retreating paws that I dared to breathe a sigh of relief. I made sure the coop was locked tight, the animals safe, and I didn't leave the shed until I was sure the jackals weren't coming back. I never saw them again after that night, but I know now that even in the quietest of places, danger can be lurking just beyond the brush. From that day on, I made sure to never let my guard down, even when the sun had set. The farm was peaceful again, but the memory of those glowing eyes would stay with me forever. The jackal and the hen. It was a late afternoon when I first saw it, just a fleeting shadow through the thick brush near the field behind my house. I didn't think much of it at first, just a small blur, maybe a stray dog. I had other things on my mind, chores, getting dinner ready, and the fact that the sun would soon set. But later, as I walked toward the barn to collect some eggs, I noticed the strange tracks in the dirt by the chicken coop. They were too large to belong to a dog, and too clawed to be a cat. The ground was soft from the recent rain, leaving deep impressions, long and sharp. A jackal, I thought, though I had never seen one so close before. The tracks led straight to the coop. I didn't like the feeling it gave me, the eerie stillness of the evening settling around me. The wind was barely moving, and the trees seemed frozen in place. My thoughts kept drifting back to the shadow I had seen earlier. What if that's what the tracks belonged to? The hens were still in their roosts when I opened the coop door. They clucked nervously, shifting around in the dim light. But everything seemed fine. I went ahead and collected the eggs, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. As I turned to leave, I heard something. A low growl, almost muffled by the windless air. I froze. It wasn't far. Not far at all. My heart hammered in my chest as I slowly turned around. The coop door was open just enough that I could see out into the darkening field. The shadow I had seen earlier stood there now, more distinct. A jackal, its yellow eyes gleaming in the fading light. It wasn't running or hiding, just standing there, watching. I backed away slowly, making sure not to make any sudden moves. But I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just leave the hens unprotected. I grabbed the nearest stick, a sturdy branch from the tree by the barn. I didn't want to hurt it, but I couldn't let it get any closer. My hands were trembling, and I could feel the sweat on my palms. The jackal didn't move at first. It just stood there, its eyes locked onto me. Then, with a sharp, sudden movement, it darted forward. I swung the stick with everything I had, hitting it hard. The jackal yelped, its body recoiling back into the darkness of the trees. I didn't stop. I kept swinging the stick in the direction it had run, yelling in a way I'd never thought myself capable of. It wasn't until I was out of breath, my heart still racing, that I heard it, a rustling noise, then silence. No growl. No movement. I stood there, catching my breath, my hands shaking as I lowered the stick. The field in front of me was still and quiet again, but now, I noticed something else. The hens were calm, quiet even. It was like they knew they were safe now. It was then th.
It was a quiet evening, the kind where everything feels calm until it doesn't. I was taking a walk down the gravel road near my house, something I did almost every night. There was a chill in the air, but it wasn't anything too unusual for late autumn. The moon hung low, casting enough light that I didn't feel completely alone, but not enough to make the shadows disappear. I had just rounded the corner when I heard the sound of paws padding behind me. It wasn't fast, more like a slow, steady pace, and it sounded like it was keeping distance, but it was there. I thought it was just a neighbor's dog, maybe following me for a bit, so I didn't worry at first. But then, it stopped. I couldn't hear it anymore. I slowed my walk, glancing over my shoulder. Nothing. No dog. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I kept walking, telling myself it was nothing. But then, the sound came again. This time it was closer. A few feet away, maybe. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the tightness building in my chest. That's when I heard it. A low growl, not from a distance, but from right behind me. My heart skipped, and I turned, half expecting a large, growling dog. But there was nothing there. Just empty road. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that made me feel more exposed, more vulnerable. I kept moving, faster now. I told myself I was just overthinking it. Dogs bark all the time. Maybe it was a stray that had wandered off, or something else, but whatever it wasn't following me. The growl from behind wasn't real. I told myself that, but then, the ground beneath my feet shifted, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of something brushing against my leg. My heart slammed into my chest as I spun around. A dog, its eyes wild and unblinking, was standing inches away. It was thin, too thin, like it hadn't eaten in weeks. Its fur was matted and dirty, and it had this unnerving, almost hungry look in its eyes. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The dog didn't bark. It didn't make a sound. But it was there, and for a long, uncomfortable moment, we just stared at each other. I felt the fear crawl up my spine. It was like this dog wasn't just a stray, it was something far more dangerous. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the dog backed up slowly, its eyes still on me. It turned and disappeared into the darkness of the trees on the side of the road, vanishing like it had never been there. I stood still for a few seconds, waiting for the air to settle, my heart still pounding. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to finish my walk. I turned around, retracing my steps quickly, until I reached the safety of my house. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with a nervous hand. I don't know if it was just a wild dog, or if something about it felt different, like it was stalking me for a reason. But I do know this: after that night, I stopped walking that road. It might sound paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching, and I wasn't about to give it another chance to show up. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world feels like it's holding its breath. I had just finished work and was walking home down the empty street, the cold air biting at my skin. The street lights flickered every now and then, casting long, uneven shadows on the pavement. I was just about to round the corner when I noticed them, a pack of dogs, maybe 4 or 5, standing across the street. They weren't barking or making any noise, just staring at me, unmoving. I slowed my pace, trying to get a better look. They weren't the usual friendly dogs you'd see around town. These were different. Their coats were matted, their eyes wild with something unsettling. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was an aggression in their stillness. Something primal. It made my skin crawl. I glanced around, but there was no one else on the street. I wasn't far from home, but the idea of walking past those dogs, who seemed to be waiting for me, filled me with dread. I could feel my heartbeat quicken. I tried to convince myself that maybe they were just stray dogs, hungry or lost, but the way they stood there, so still and focused on me, told me otherwise. I started walking again, this time more cautiously, keeping an eye on the dogs. I hoped they'd just leave me alone. But as I took a few more steps, I noticed something worse. One of the dogs had started moving, slowly circling around to the other side of the street. I froze. The others didn't move, but this one, it was moving closer, keeping its eyes locked on mine. Its low growl was the only sound I could hear. I picked up my pace, not running, but definitely speeding up. My mind raced. Should I turn back? Keep walking? The dog was closing the distance, now only a few yards away. I glanced behind me and saw that the rest of the pack hadn't moved. But this one, the one circling, was definitely coming for me. I wasn't sure why, but I instinctively reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It felt stupid, but I dialed 911 quickly. I didn't know what I would say. There's a dog following me, but the line rang. I didn't care, I just needed someone to hear me. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, which only made me feel more on edge. I think I'm being followed by a dog, maybe more than one, I stammered. I'm just walking home, and they're acting weird. I could hear her typing in the background. Are you safe? Can you get to a public place? I'm on the street, but there are no cars, no people. It's just me and these dogs. One's moving toward me, I said, my breath coming faster now. Stay on the line, sir. Help is on the way. Is there a way you can get to shelter? I looked around, my heart hammering in my chest. I was only a block away from my apartment. I decided to make a break for it. I told the operator I was going to run and hung up quickly, trying to stay as calm as I could. I turned and sprinted, not looking back. I could hear the dog's paws behind me, just a few feet away. It wasn't barking. It was just running after me, almost like it was toying with me. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning. My apartment was close. Just a little farther. I made it to my building and shoved the door open, slamming it behind me as I gasped for air. I leaned against the door, heart racing. I didn't know if the dog was still out there. I didn't know if the others were waiting, but for now, I was safe. I made sure to lock the door. I don't know what it was that made those dogs follow me, whether they were just hungry, confused, or something darker, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never walk down that street again after dark. I don't know if they were just strays or something more, but the look in their eyes made it clear that sometimes, what seems harmless at first can quickly turn into something much more dangerous. I'm just glad I made it home in one piece. It was a quiet evening, the kind where everything feels a little too still. I had just finished work and decided to take my usual walk through the neighborhood to clear my head. I liked the routine, the cool air, the quiet streets, the familiar houses. It was peaceful. As I turned down an alley that cut through a row of houses, I heard something behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a cat scurrying through the grass. But then, I heard it again, soft, steady footsteps. It didn't sound like someone walking, though. The steps were too heavy, too uneven, like something else was out there. I slowed down, trying to figure out what it was. A few seconds later, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The footsteps weren't following me in a straight line, but more like they were circling, closing in. My pulse quickened, and I turned my head, half expecting to see someone walking toward me. But there was nothing, no one. Just empty space. Then, I heard a growl. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but deep enough that it sent a chill through me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The growl came again, a little closer this time. My mind raced. What the hell was it? A dog? But it didn't sound like any dog I'd ever heard. The growl was raw, almost like it was coming from something much bigger, something wild. I started walking faster, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a stray dog was out there, or maybe I was just hearing things. But then I heard it again, closer. I broke into a jog, the sound of those heavy steps behind me growing louder with every second. I didn't dare turn around. My only focus was getting home. I took a sharp turn onto the main road, hoping the streetlights and the noise from passing cars would make me feel safer. But as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw it. A large shadow moved quickly across the street, barely visible in the dim light. Its shape was huge, almost unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the glow of eyes staring directly at me. Panic set in, and I sprinted toward my apartment, my legs burning from the effort. My mind was a blur of thoughts. What was it? Why was it following me? But I didn't stop running, not until I reached my front door. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I finally managed to unlock the door and slam it shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to steady my breath. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. Nothing. No growl. No footsteps. Just silence. I locked all the doors and windows, pulled the curtains, and sat on the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that shouldn't have been. Hours later, I walked to the window, pulled back the curtain slightly, and peered outside. The street was empty, just like
I was walking home through the woods, as I always did, when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A tortoise. But not just any tortoise, this one was massive. Its shell was covered in dirt and moss, as though it had been here for years. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but no. There it was, just sitting there in the middle of the narrow path, staring at me with eyes that were too wide, too alert for a creature so slow. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something. I backed up, careful not to make any sudden moves. The air around me felt heavier, like something was off. I looked around, no other animals, no birds chirping, just dead silence. I had always walked this trail, and this was the first time I'd seen anything like that. As I moved to step around it, the tortoise started moving. Slowly, as you'd expect, but something about its movements didn't seem natural. It wasn't just plodding along like I had seen before in my neighborhood park. It was deliberate. It almost seemed to be following my steps. I picked up the pace, hoping to just get out of its way. That's when I heard the noise. It was a low rustling, coming from the underbrush behind me. I turned, heart pounding, but nothing. Maybe a rabbit, or some small animal moving through the leaves. But no. I heard it again, closer this time, and that's when I saw them. Rabbits. A dozen of them, standing perfectly still in the bushes, their eyes all focused on me. I couldn't breathe. The rabbits weren't moving. They weren't twitching like they normally do when startled. They just stared. All I could think was that something wasn't right. Why were they so still? Why were they watching me? I started to walk faster, trying to push away the panic that was building in my chest. But I could feel something was behind me. That tortoise. It wasn't far anymore. I broke into a run. I wasn't looking back, but I could feel it, that heavy, deliberate pace. I could hear the soft scraping sound of its shell dragging over the dirt. Closer and closer. My legs burned, and the woods seemed to stretch on forever. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. My breath was coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Then, there was a loud rustling sound, followed by a series of thumps, like something heavy had dropped. I stumbled, almost falling as I spun around. The tortoise was no longer following me. It had stopped, right there in the middle of the path. And behind it, the rabbits. They were all around it now, as if they had suddenly come to life, hopping and darting in every direction. But they weren't acting like normal rabbits. They were too fast, too coordinated. I stood frozen, watching. I didn't know whether to run or stay. But in that moment, everything just stopped. The rabbits scattered, running off in all directions. The tortoise, too, slowly turned and began to crawl back into the underbrush, disappearing just like that, without a sound. I stood there for a long time, too afraid to move. When I finally got the courage to walk again, I kept my eyes on the ground, terrified that I would see something else. But the woods were silent again, almost peaceful. The normal sounds of nature had returned. I didn't look back until I reached the edge of the woods, my heart still pounding in my chest. It was as if whatever had happened back there, whatever I had seen, wasn't real. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never walk that path again. Some things are better left unknown, and that day, I learned there are some creatures in this world you just don't mess with. It was a late afternoon when I first noticed them. I was walking down the dirt path by the forest, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. The place always gave me a feeling of quiet unease, like something was just out of sight, waiting. As I neared the old oak tree, I saw them, 2 rabbits. They were just sitting there, staring at me. Their fur was clean, but their eyes were different. Big, dark, and too still. They didn't hop away like most rabbits do when you get too close. I tried to shake off the weird feeling crawling up my spine, but I couldn't. I kept walking, passing them quickly. But the moment I did, I felt it. A sudden rustling behind me. I spun around, expecting to see a deer or a bird. But it was just those same 2 rabbits. They hadn't moved, but something felt wrong. I could swear they were closer now. I tried to ignore it and walked faster. But then I heard something else, something that wasn't normal. The sound of something slow, dragging. I turned again, but this time it wasn't just the rabbits. There, in the distance, moving just at the edge of the trees, was a tortoise. Its shell was dark, the kind of dark that didn't reflect any light, like it was sucking in everything around it. Its head was low, almost touching the ground, as if it was crawling without a care in the world, but that dragging sound, it was coming from it. The tortoise wasn't moving normally. It was dragging its shell along the dirt, leaving a long, deep trench in its wake. The rabbits didn't leave either. They were now all around the tortoise, moving in a tight circle, and I felt my stomach tighten. I had to get out of there. I turned and started walking faster, but the path seemed longer now. Like I wasn't getting anywhere. And behind me, the sound of dragging followed. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it. Slow, steady. Closer. It was only when I reached the end of the path, panting, hands shaking, that I looked back. The rabbits and the tortoise were gone. The path behind me was empty. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to calm myself, but nothing made sense. What was that? Was I imagining things? I didn't go back to that path for a long time after that. When I did, I was with a friend. It was bright daylight, the sun high in the sky, and there were no strange rabbits or tortoises. Just the usual forest animals, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I hear that dragging sound again. Very faint, almost like it's in the back of my mind. And I can't help but wonder if something was there that day, something that shouldn't have been. Maybe I'll never know what it was, but I've learned to trust that feeling of unease. Some things aren't meant to be figured out. And when I hear the rustling of the grass, I don't stop to look anymore. I just keep moving. The sun had just set, and the woods were quieter than I'd ever known them to be. I'd been walking for what felt like hours, alone, my only company being the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots. I should have turned back by now. The path I'd chosen wasn't marked on any map, but curiosity had pulled me this far. The trees here were thicker, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, and the air felt colder, even though it was still fall. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. There were signs of animals, broken twigs, fur, and patches of dirt scuffed up in patterns. But it wasn't just any animal. It was like the footprints of rabbits, but much larger, almost unnaturally large. I tried to shake off the growing unease. The woods were full of wildlife, after all. Maybe it was just an odd animal I hadn't seen before, but then, I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then I heard it again, quick, sharp, and then another, followed by a rustling sound. I froze, straining my ears. It was too precise to be the wind. Something, or someone, was out there. I stepped off the main trail and crouched low, my heart pounding in my chest. The rustling grew louder. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet didn't move. I had to know what it was, and then, I saw them. Rabbits. But these weren't normal rabbits. They were unnaturally large, almost the size of dogs. Their fur was matted, and their eyes glowed strangely in the dimming light. They moved quickly, darting between the trees, their ears twitching at the slightest sound. I should have backed away then, but something rooted me to the spot. I watched as one of the creatures paused, sniffing the air, and then, without warning, it turned toward me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't the way a rabbit would look at you. It was as if it had seen me, really seen me, and it wasn't afraid. My body was still frozen, my legs unwilling to move as the creature took a slow, deliberate step toward me. It was almost as if it was waiting for something, waiting for me to react, to make a move, to give it a reason to do something. I had to snap out of it. I turned quickly, forcing myself to run, my feet pounding against the forest floor, the sound of the rabbit's movements echoing around me. I didn't dare look back. The trees around me seemed to close in, and every sound, every snap of a twig, felt like it was just behind me. I ran blindly for what felt like forever, until I suddenly broke through the trees and found myself back on a familiar road. My chest was heaving, my throat dry, and I could barely catch my breath. I kept running, though. I didn't stop until I made it to the nearest town, where the lights of the street lamps felt like a safety I hadn't realized I needed. I never did find out exactly what those creatures were. But I know this much: there's something out there, in those woods, something that waits and watches. I'm never going back, and I'll never forget the feeling of those glowing eyes staring straight through me. And as for those rabbits, they weren't the kind you'd find in a storybook. They were something else. Something I'm not sure I want to understand. It was a late afternoon, and I decided to take a walk through the woods near my house. The trees had started to change color, their leaves now a mix of deep orange and dark red, and the air was crisp, a sign that autumn was settling in. I needed some fresh air to clear my mind. As I walked, the sounds of tea,